as Coughlin said, I'm part of the Gerbode lab, and I'm going to share some pretty pictures with you and some hopefully cool ideas about particles that spin as hexagonal vortices within their circular matrix. So first, the game plan for today. This is materials, so we have a lot to cover about the system before I tell you more about my thesis project and how we're taking it further. So we're dealing with crystals, and these are not the kind of crystals that you would expect from, say, Chem 23. These are polycrystals, which are composed of different grains at different orientations, and they're separated by a grain boundary. Now, the grain boundary is just the region between the grains where the lattice points don't line up because the grains are misaligned. And it's also important to note that this is a soft crystal. We basically just have these micron-sized glass spheres that are floating in an aqueous solution that are confined to this triangular lattice because we have put them between very thin layer between two glass microscope slides, which confines them to be one layer, and it also confines them to that they have to pack efficiently. This is a static system where we don't really care about quantum mechanics, just a lot of brownian motion. And there's no chemistry holding the particles together. So they can, evolve as grains, grow and shrink, exchange particles, and this process is known collectively as grain coarsening. Soft matter research is interested in grain coarsening and polycrystals because the composition of the polycrystal has impacts on the conductivity or the strength of the material. Hello, Resnay Lab. And now let's be a little more specific with our system. We can put grains inside of other grains. This is called a grain boundary loop. And according to something called continuum theory and grain coarsening broadly, this kind of setup implies that the interior grain will shrink over time. Eventually, all the particles inside will become aligned with the red grain. And continuum theory also predicts that the subgrain will shrink at a linear rate, at a constant rate over time. And does that actually really play out? Let's see. Well, first of all, I can show you a video of how this works in 14 times speed. You see things jiggling, you see the grain go poof, because it has aligned itself. Now, does this actually play out experimentally? Well, the continuum theory prediction is this black line, the constant dissolution rate, the constant shrinkage rate. And the blue is our experimental results from one grade. You can see that this is a little dire, isn't it? We have basically a piecewise linear system, which is composed of steps and plateaus and steps and plateaus. And what this really means for us is that, we have one dramatic case where it's deviating from continuum theory, but also we have so many other experiments where you get this step pattern and plateau pattern. So what is the difference between plateaus and steps? How can we explain this? And, having two discrete phases, plateau and step, hints that the crystal switches between two distinct mechanical processes, that two behaviors dominate at different times. The potential breakthrough here is that if we can isolate which mechanisms correspond with each step and plateau, then we can maybe have a model that predicts granule dissolution, grain dissolution rather, much more accurately. And this is potentially a conflict with continuum theory, a challenge to it, because having a constant dissolution rate also implies that there's just one mechanism going on here, and we think that there's more than one. So let's look at the motion in action. Can we convince ourselves that there's different mechanisms here? So what we have are two images showing initial particle positions, and these are two different sets of particles, with little red arrows showing where those particles will be in less than 10 seconds time. The exact second-to-second difference is negligible here. And as well, we have how the grain boundary changes over that time. Now, on the left, you can see that the lower grain sort of slips with respect to the upper grain. Its arrows point downward to the left more on aggregate. And this process shears off 4 particles across the grain boundary. Whereas on the right here, we have groups of particles spinning together in a coordinated motion to align themselves and cross the grain boundary through a rotation rather than through linear displacement. Now, where is each behavior? Can we prove to ourselves that this correlates with the shape that we see? Now, I can't convince you guys of this. You'll just have to trust me when I say that. When we look across intervals of these plateaus, we really only down the steps, we see tons and tons of little vortices throughout our lattice that take place. So we know that we're onto something here. But we still need a metric to qualify displacement, or rather quantify displacement. Exactly, quantify rotation. If we can find a way to measure the rotationness of our system, then we can maybe identify the vortices more particularly. That parameter is called vorticity. And let's just take a look at the left side of the screen for now. Imagine you have 3 particles, and they each take a random walk in one direction. You can take the cross product of the initial position vector with the displacement vector and convince ourselves, with our little right hands, that clockwise rotations point into the board, positive direction, and counterclockwise rotations would point out of the board with respect to the center of the triangle formed by this triangular cell of particles. When we add up all 3 cross products for each of the 3 vectors of our cell, then we get the vorticity of the triangular cell. So what does this mean? More positive vorticity means higher clockwise rotation, and more negative vorticity is more clockwise rotation. Let's see if we can apply this to our toy example here, this experimental case. Take the initial particle positions, overlay the final ones, draw our triangles, and I'm going to take one more step here to put a color map on it. Whoa. Hexagonal vortices here. And in this case, blue corresponds to more negative or counterclockwise vorticity, and the yellow is the opposite. So we have particles spinning as hexagons. What does that look like here in actuality? Well, you see each of these hexagon regions rotating clockwise across the grain boundary. Does vorticity line up? Yeah, it kind of does. And in the shearing case, we can also apply vorticity to convince ourselves that, well, we've applied the same color map, but the colors are weaker because there's just not as much rotation going on. So in addition to being a good quantitative parameter, there's also even a better qualitative parameter to look at to detect the differences between these 2 mechanisms and decide whether it's one or the other. So where does that leave us here? We have 2 mechanisms, granule rotation, which is the hexagonal rotation, and shearing effects. They correspond with different regions along granule dissolution, and so we know that we potentially have a case against the continuum theory prediction. At this point, you might be thinking, what is Helen doing with her research? And I can tell you that what I'm going to be focusing on is a deep dive into granule rotation itself. We want to predict when it happens, why are they hexagons, and to what extent does this challenge continuum theory? Can we provide more details about when hexagons appear, what size they will be, what position they'll be in? The more details we can provide, the better model we can perhaps help the theorists develop. What intuition can we use to predict granule rotation? Recall that there's a free energy associated with grain boundary loops, and that our system wants to shrink to, maximize that free energy. Excuse me, sorry. Anyway, we want to shrink to minimize the free energy and get over the free energy barrier associated with aligning itself. But if we try to align the subgrain all at once, then that's a very high free energy barrier to overcome. So we think that granule rotation is taking very small energy barriers and overcoming them, and that's like the fastest way to dissolve the grain while still being energetically accessible along the way. We know that this can work because previous students' research looking at a particular kind of granule rotation using 3 grains has given them the ability to predict these free energy barriers in these systems where you can already sort of see the hexagons in their case. So we know that this is transferable. How did they do it? Well, they took some StatMech, and obviously not correct. I've been throwing around the word free energy a lot, and I want to specify that I mean Helmholtz free energy, which is a function of potential energy, temperature, and entropy. We can get rid of the potential energy because this is a hard sphere system, leaving us with free energy as a function of entropy because temperature is constant. And we can calculate the entropy of the system by taking every ith particle and finding its what we call the free space, the VI. This is the space accessible to each particle, the center of each particle, before it can collide with another neighboring particle. We divide by the area of each particle's silhouette to make the units work out in the natural log, and then we can multiply everything through by the Boltzmann constant at the end to make the total units work out. This is still kind of in progress, though. We need to get more experiments to analyze this further. And we have really a more developed case about the question of why hexagons. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour, hold that thought on hexagons, and ask if you've ever heard of Moiré pattern before. This is like the interference pattern between the square lattice of your computer screen and the square lattice of your phone camera whenever you try to take a picture of your computer screen with your phone. And the interference pattern reflects the underlying geometry of the lattices that are interfering with each other. It happens that two triangular lattices form a hexagonal Moiré pattern. Now, we only have one layer of particles at a time, but the action of switching from one grain to the other grain is effectively a two-lattice problem. So imagine extending the outlying lattice into the interior lattice. And so the fastest way for particles to align themselves with the outlying grain is to find the nearest lattice position that corresponds with the outer grain. So in this case, moving from like one grain to another is a simple case of rotating each particle towards the imaginary lattice points placed on top of it from the other lattice. It forms this hexagonal Moiré pattern, and we get granules. We also know that the larger the misorientation angle, the smaller the hexagon, so we can predict the size of these. And when we overlay the Moiré pattern on top of experimental results, we see that this aligns with vorticity very well. So the next steps for our research, we know the size and shape of granules based on Moiré patterns, but we haven't really fully solved the free energy problem yet. Rather, we predict we have a good foundation, but we need to actually apply it to do the whole diversity of cases where granule rotation occurs, look at the kinds of energy barriers. And then we need to codify our results to ship it off to the theorists so that they can develop a better theory of grain boundary motion for our system.